Darfur's misery. This massive humanitarian crisis isn't getting any better, and the world seems divided about what to do next. Are sanctions and more UN troops the answer? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. The United Nations Security Council is hearing an array of opinions about what to do next about the deep and often misunderstood conflict in Darfur. At a meeting on Thursday, some countries were warning against sanctions on the Sudanese government, but other nations have been taking a much tougher line. The US and UK seem fed up. They are pushing for UN sanctions.
The world needs to act. If President Bashir does not meet his obligations, the United States of America will act.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair also took a tough stance, saying, "We have waited and waited. We have tried diplomacy and negotiation again and again with the Sudanese government, but they have to get the message that the international community will not allow the scandal that is Darfur to continue." But fellow Security Council members China, Russia and South Africa say now is not the time for sanctions. It was just this week when Sudan agreed to let 3,000 UN peacekeepers into the country to beef up the African Union force on the ground in Darfur. The UN called it good news and emphasized the need for international action.
The people in Darfur have suffered too much and too long. International community should do whatever we can do at this time.
However, exactly what the international community will do remains unclear, as it appears it is divided on what stance to take. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has agreed to let UN peacekeeping troops into his country, but he's turning the tables on some countries, accusing their governments of creating Sudan's problems. He says the West is to blame.
All the problems Sudan has been facing, whether in the south or in Darfur, are the work of Western intelligence agencies.
And joining us now from Washington to talk more about this is Al Jazeera's United Nations correspondent Mark Seddon. Mark, George Bush and Tony Blair have been talking tough. They want more sanctions on Sudan. How is this playing out at the United Nations?
Well, as you mentioned, the United Nations was quite pleased, and certainly the Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, was quite pleased that at last they seem to have secured the agreement of the Sudanese regime to allow this hybrid force in. There is some concern that this could perhaps be a little bit counterproductive. Of course, these agreements have unravelled before, but, you know, people were saying at the UN it looked like this was a sticking one, with 3,000 extra troops hopefully on their way. But you see, from the United States and the United Kingdom's position, because they've seen these things unravel before, they're not altogether confident that the Sudanese will keep their word. And of course, this UN Sanctions Committee have produced further evidence to suggest that the Sudanese government have been airlifting arms into Darfur using unmarked aircraft. So, you know, this has given added impetus to people who want to take a much tougher line in Washington and in London.
The countries not too keen to take a tough line, South Africa, China and Russia, they are against sanctions. What's behind that?
Well, you know, China, of course, is a substantial trading partner with the Sudan now, but it has to be said too, the Chinese have played a pretty important role in recent weeks in finally forcing the Khartoum regime to acknowledge that they had to accept this hybrid force from the UN to back up the African Union forces already there. Now, of course, this hybrid force isn't nearly as big and as powerful as the UN originally wanted, but, you know, people at the UN who want to talk about diplomacy and moving things forward are saying, you know, this is how it works, you know, things are incremental. Of course, lots of campaigners and, of course, the British and the American government saying, well, we haven't got time for this anymore. We can't allow another Rwanda, another genocide. There are some people who call this genocide. So it's a question of, you know, whether you want to get a complete agreement across the board and move together as the UN has to achieve something, or if you're the British and the Americans, you don't really believe the Sudanese government is serious, and therefore you threaten in order to make them, they believe, to do what the international community wants them to do.
Mark, is this an issue that interests Americans? Are they pushing for any type of intervention or further sanctions?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I have noticed, you know, there's not a huge amount of interest in international affairs in the United States. That is simply a fact. However, when it comes to Iraq, there clearly is, because Iraq impacts on the United States. But interestingly, Darfur too. There's been a very powerful campaign, a very powerful campus campaign for intervention in Darfur. It seems to have brought a myriad of groups together, and of course they have quite powerful spokespeople, both in the political sphere and in the sphere of Hollywood. I mean, we've spoken to George Clooney and Mia Farrow, both prominent campaigners on Darfur. All of these people have been pretty influential, you know.
Mark, you touched on it briefly, but just tell us more about what the UN is saying about accusations that the Sudanese government is disguising military aircraft to look like UN planes to fly weapons into Darfur.
Yes, they are saying that unmarked planes or planes painted white, or essentially planes that don't have any forces markings on them, have been engaged in this sort of activity, which of course encourages those in Washington and London to believe that the Sudanese will continue, even if this hybrid force goes in, until they succeed, the government, in doing what they set out to do, which is to ethnically cleanse this particular part of Sudan.
Okay, thanks Mark Seddon for that update. More now on that leaked UN report. It was apparently given to the Associated Press on Wednesday and accuses the Sudanese government of disguising military aircraft to look like UN planes. Al Jazeera has not yet seen a copy of the report, but it seems to confirm an open secret circulating in Darfur for a while now. Now, Lucy Ashton has more on that.
This might look like a UN plane, but it's allegedly a Sudanese military aircraft in disguise. Laid out beside it are rows of bombs guarded by Sudanese soldiers. The implication of the UN report is that Khartoum, in breach of a UN arms embargo, is using this plane and others to transport weapons to Darfur. The report also says more than 100 bombs fell on Darfur over last winter. The Khartoum government says it's not responsible. However, it's the only party in this conflict with access to aircraft. The Sudanese government has denounced the photos and the UN report. But this is not the first time Khartoum has been accused of disguising its army. The African Union, the people who run peacekeeping in Darfur, accused Sudan of playing a similar trick with their logo on white helicopters. The AU says Sudan disguised both vehicles and soldiers to launch surprise attacks against rebels. Khartoum says the vehicles are rented and used for transportation only. Whatever the truth, confusing identities appear to be adding to the chaos of this already confusing conflict.
Now, earlier on Thursday, Al Jazeera's Darren Jordan spoke to Nafi al-Nafi, a senior assistant to the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Mr. Nafi reacted to the UN report. He also shared his thoughts about President Bush's accusation that the Sudanese government had broken its promises on Darfur.
We have never agreed to something that we are backing up from it at all. Who says so? These are the Americans and the British. If it is agreement between ourselves and the AK and the AU and UN, they know that we have honored every and each agreement we have done. It is the Americans and the British who say so.
Okay, well, let's stick with the Americans and the British for a minute, because both President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair say the time for promises from the Sudanese government is over and have threatened strict UN sanctions against Sudan unless you act over Darfur. What's your reaction to that?
Our reaction is that this is not true. The fact that even in a couple of days, 10 days or less, there was a high consultation committee in Addis Ababa where there was a representative from UN, AU, and Sudan government, and they agreed to every and each piece of the heavy package deal, which was the main issue, with the exception of the use of 6 fighting helicopters. And even this bending point has been agreed to by the Sudan government after consultation and explanation from the AU and UN. So now we are in full agreement with UN and AU on the 3 stages, and we are just waiting for the United Nations to support and to release the support to the AU, okay, including the heavy package.
All right, but the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has expressed grave concerns about reports of arms being smuggled into Darfur in aircraft disguised with UN colours. Is it true?
It is the Americans who say so. This is a very old allegation. and it has been discussed very thoroughly between Sudan and UN, and we have discussed it ourselves. I was one of the Sudanese who talked to the Americans about it, and that was 2, 3, 4 months ago.
So you're categorically denying that that is the case?
It is not my denying. I'm saying why is it being raised now? And by the Americans. It is not raised by the UN. You are not correct when you say Secretary General said so. Now, this is a confusion. This is a deliberate confusion. Now we have a full agreement, and people are trying to dig all the allegations just to cover this. And
OK, all right. So final question, in terms of a timetable, when exactly will UN troops be allowed in?
It's not UN. We have the AU, and we have technical groups under the leadership of the AU commander, and they are welcome anytime that is seen possible. This is for the AU to decide, for the UN to decide. As far as Sudan is concerned, we feel the UN is delaying, actually.
We're going to be taking a very short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk to one of the world's top experts on Sudan. Stay with us.